Hello whisky fans. Show of hands, who in my last video where I looked at the Bell's original blended Scotch whisky, how many of you noticed this? This is Bell's 8-year-old, so this is a recently reintroduced product. I'm not sure if I'd call it a new product, because an 8-year-old product has been in the Bell's inventory going back at least as far as the 1950s. And actually, during the 1990s here in the UK, the standard product from Bell's actually took on the 8-year-old age statement. That was the standard entry-level product. That was the bottom rung of the ladder. And the reason for that was the whisky lock. Not myself, but the whisky lock was something that kind of happened, though it wasn't a physical thing, in the 1980s. Because in the 1980s there was not a lot of demand for Scotch whisky. In particular, as trends dictated that a lot of people moved over to clear spirits like vodka and gin, and also perhaps because in certain parts of the world people didn't find themselves with a disposable income that they did in previous times, there was a huge slump in sales of whisky, which meant that a lot of distilleries who had been producing whisky in large volumes previously suddenly found that they had warehouses bursting with casks that just had no buyer. And that's where the phrase whisky lock, for any of you that haven't heard of it, comes from. The idea that all of these distilleries that suddenly had no sales and they weren't making any money, they were sitting on such huge reserves of whisky that you could fill a lock with it. So in the 1990s, because whisky going into blenders was in such steady supply and there was so much of it and it was so cheap, especially the good stuff was very cheap and available to blenders, Bell's actually decided to up their standard product up to an 8-year-old. Now, all good things come to an end. In the late 2000s, we're talking about around 15 years ago now, sorry to remind you all, but that is the case. I think it was around 2008, Bell's actually dropped the 8-year-old age statement and went back to the now much more familiar Bell's Original, and we can probably assume that the reason for that was probably because as whisky became more popular again, the whiskies available to blenders and independent bottlers became in more scarce supply and more expensive, so they obviously lowered the age statement, started putting some more cheaper stock in there. Until very recently, I think this year actually, this certainly hasn't been available anywhere I've been looking until very recently, Bell's decided to reintroduce the 8-year-old alongside the no age statement original expression. And any of you that follow me on Twitter, you might have seen a tweet that I sent out talking about this, because it's been fairly heavily advertised on TV here in the UK, alongside the no age statement expression. But this one, I've checked all of the supermarkets and even all of the online retailers, couldn't find it anywhere. I eventually found this a few days ago. This is a new one that I've just got in a local independent shop, believe it or not. So, without much ado, let's get some in the glass and see what we've got. So in theory, you would think that this should be a more premium. It feels wrong to use the word premium for something that still only cost me £25, even without being on offer, £25 full price. But this should be a more premium, better made, more flavourful, more featured packed whisky than the no age statement blend. You'd think so, wouldn't you? Still a screw top, still 40%. As for the colour, that is obviously a thicker bottle. I would say that the colour is probably identical. So a little bit of caramel colouring, not huge amount, but quite a bit. And almost certainly chill filtered as well, because that is a very, very clear whisky. But we didn't really need to say any of those things, because when you're paying £25 for a 40% whisky, you kind of know, don't you? So, Bell's 8-year-old on the nose. So again, very grain driven. And that's not a bad thing, because the no age statement, or 3-year-old Bell's, it's also a very grain forward whisky. And I don't mind that. Grain whisky is its own thing. Some people enjoy it, a lot of people don't. What I am getting in the nose of this 8-year-old expression that I didn't get in the 3-year-old, there's a distinct note of burnt caramel and dry gristiness, so dry cereal barley notes. Interestingly, I'm also getting a little hint, not much, but a little hint of dirty smoke and also a little hint of youth. Obvious youth. I would say even though this is an 8-year-old whiskey, the youth on this one, it just feels so much more than it does on the 3-year-old no age statement product. It is interesting though that they've decided to put a smoky, slightly background phenolic note on this one. It'd be really interesting to compare this 8-year-old with an 8-year-old Bell's from the 1990s or 1980s to see if it always had that slight smoky character, because it may have done. But I'm also thinking that everyone knows that peated whiskey is so popular now, and people have such a higher tolerance for it now than they ever did in the past, possibly. So it'd be interesting to see if that's a modern addition. I'd say that the peat on this one, it is very light, but it's a faint, fumy, slightly industrial and slightly salty peat. I'm also getting a background note of apple peel and orangey sherry, and I think the sherry is still light and a background flavour on this one as it was on the 3-year-old, but there's a little bit more than there was before. Slightly spirity. The spiritiness and the youth, I think it's just a little bit more apparent on this one. And again, that just obvious grain note as well, which is not a bad thing, but it's definitely there. What I do get on this one though, that I didn't on the 3-year-old, is that there's a slight harsh prickle on the nose. It's just that little bit less refined than the 3-year-old was. Let's see how it tastes. Strangely, the peat is still very faint, but it's quite peat forward. The peat arrives early on the palate, and it's a faint, slightly dirty, slightly earthy peat. I'd say that the peat in this one is a little bit less than you'd expect on something like an Ardmore. Also getting some quite pleasant caramel malt notes, a little bit of milk chocolate, and that chocolatiness really blends in really well with that slightly dry earthy peatiness. Getting some vanilla and coconut grain notes, and I would say that the palate, although nice, it's simpler and milder than the nose would lead you to believe, and I think that's probably a result of the ABV. Something that I quite often find in low ABV whiskies. The nose sort of builds up and the palate doesn't follow up, but it's decent. As for the finish, I'm getting lots of notes of toasted grains, more milk chocolate, but it really fades and disappears very, very quickly. You can kind of see the angle that they've gone for with this one, and I applaud them for going for an 8-year-old age statement, because 8 years, it might impress some blend drinkers perhaps that are used to not seeing an age statement at all, but it's not an age statement that impresses the high spenders in the whiskey world. I also think that with this whiskey, it seems to me like they've gone for an apparent slightly higher malt content, but I think that by doing that, that slightly higher malt content really exposes the flaws and the roughness of the malt that is there, so it really exposes the flaws to a greater extent without the higher grain content there to smooth things out. I do think, sadly, that there's a little bit of an element of this whiskey trying unsuccessfully to be something that it's not. Yes, it is a more featured, flavour-packed whiskey. It's got slightly more character, although it's still light. It's bolder, slightly, but it's become another one of those mid-range blends that you can't really say that it's either well-made or good value. And worse than that, I do think that it actually comes over as a little bit rougher because of the makeup that they've put in this. A little bit rougher than the Bell's original no age statement, which in my opinion is much better value at about half the price. And it has a very effective and much more unique style than you get out of the 8-year-old. As for a grade, Bell's 8-year-old, I'm going to give this one a C-, so still not terrible. It's still better than the vast majority of bottom shelf blends that are out there. and probably more importantly, it is a full division below where I ranked the Bell's original no age statement. I'd say that the real sticking point is price on this one. I don't feel that you're really getting much at all above what you get with the standard bottling. If you want smokiness, if you want more single malt character, you really need to go for either a slightly premium blend or just stick to single malt, which you can get for not much more than the £25 that they're asking for this one. So on the grounds of value for money, I'm afraid this is going to have to be a whiskey that I don't recommend. I just think that the Bell's Original works so much better for what it is, and it's much better value too. So just goes to show that age doesn't always matter. Usually does. Not always. Thanks for watching. Cheers.